Today, I want to talk about Klingons for obvious reasons. I've been a Star Trek fan for as long as I can remember, and I did watch the original series. When the Klingons were introduced, they just looked like humans. Most of this had to do with the fact that it was the 1960s and there were production limits, but they were already characterized as aggressive and military and imperial, and at the time they functioned as a Cold War era rival to the Federation. Even in the early form, the seeds of what they would later become were all there. They were a species driven by strength and loyalty and an almost instinctive readiness for conflict. They weren't quite the warrior race that we saw later, but the foundation was definitely built in the original series. That was even an episode of Deep Space Nine where Cisco and Dax and Worf go back in time and they see the human-looking Klingons and they ask Worf about it and he says, "We don't talk about it with outsiders," or something to that effect. And it left the question lingering. Why did they look human in that era? So that was a pretty funny episode. I wish I could remember the name. If I remember, I'll put it in the description. If you know what it is, let me know in the comments. So then the cinematic era happened. In Star Trek III, Christopher Lloyd played a Klingon commander. I can't remember his name at the moment, but this dude was an early example of a fully realized Klingon character. His portrayal was intense, very military, cunning, ruthless, pragmatist, and there was still an internal code of respect and strength and honor. So this kind of laid the groundwork for everything that the Klingon society would become in later iterations. This period also cemented the iconic physical look with the head ridges and the armor and the more alien look and feel. And Christopher Lloyd, man, he was, if you don't know who he was Doc in Back to the Future. But in this role, he felt absolutely dangerous and very believable. So he was a character that perfectly captured the blend of brutality and discipline and pride and all the things that would later become central to the species. So by the time the Next Generation and that whole Next Generation era came about, Klingons had evolved into one of the most fully developed alien cultures in science fiction, and it was all hyper-masculine. Their society revolved around honor as a living generational currency. This was something they inherited, defended, and it could be lost. So they had to fight for their honor. They had to fight for their position. Everything was based on strength. The structure of the great houses was built around politics and family. So bloodlines mattered because they ensured the continuity of identity and authority. So for that reason, loyalty to one's house and ancestors formed the backbone of their entire purpose. And there were all these rituals surrounding combat and marriage and succession, and it reinforced a culture deeply rooted in tradition and, again, hyper-masculinity. These weren't just warriors. This was like a civilization organized around legacy and pride and preservation of cultural continuity. If a Klingon male could not give birth to heirs, then that Klingon was rejected. Worf was raised by human parents and spent his entire arc having to fight to prove that he was in fact a real Klingon. So just the idea of being raised by an alien species weakened his position, and it was only through constant battles that Worf was finally able to prove himself and take his rightful place. Later we had Star Trek Enterprise, and that was a prequel to the original series. And in that one, the Klingons somehow had their head ridges, and you would think, hey, this takes place before the original series. In the original series, they looked human. Why do they have their head ridges in this prequel? And it was pretty satisfying. It was explained that there was a genetic virus that altered their appearance into the smoother human look that was seen in the original series. The storyline was a great way to resolve the long-standing visual inconsistency, and it also respected the established lore. So they could have ignored it. Instead, they turned the discrepancy into a meaningful story arc within the Klingon society. I can't remember the exact explanation, but I think it had something to do with Sung and Khan or Khan's people or something like that. But either way, it reinforced the sense that their culture had endured trials and transformations over time. So then we had the Klingons in Star Trek Discovery, and these things were unrecognizable. Their speech patterns were different. There was a dramatic change in their physical structure. The pigmentation in their skin was much darker, like black or gray or blue almost. And it completely disconnected from decades of established portrayal. So it wasn't that it was an update, it was just like a break from continuity. And that was a deal breaker for me. I remember watching the first episode and seeing the supposed Klingons. I was just checked out. When you look around online, you see all these really weak explanations. Like one explanation is that they shave their head during wartime, but shaving their head doesn't change the pigment of their skin or the length of their skulls or their facial or body changes. Some explanations were that it was different houses, and we've never seen these houses. Not really buying that either. The bottom line is they don't really have a clear explanation. They just made a stupid decision and they changed something that shouldn't have been changed. And I think this raises a bigger question in the later series, like Starfleet Academy. How did they go back to being regular? If all these extreme redesigns were introduced, what narrative explanation could account for them returning to the classic look? And the question becomes even more pointed in the context of how the new character is portrayed in Starfleet Academy. They have a full-on gay Klingon, and the dude prances around in dresses and skirts, and he's delicate, and he's a pacifist, and he's super gay, and he's got 2 dads and 1 mom, and all of these things are just basically the opposite of how Klingon society has functioned for as long as it's been a thing. Klingon culture is tied to honor and lineage and exclusivity and mating bonds and continuity of houses. And how do you have any of that when you have 2 dads and a mom and gay people that can't procreate? And here's where people get tripped up. I say things like that, and immediately I bet some of you bristled, but we're not talking about humans, we're talking about Klingons. Therefore, human sensibilities don't apply. Let's take the Ferengi, for example. Ferengi don't let their women wear clothing in public. Ferengi don't let their women conduct business. If you've seen any of my old videos, you know that my wife is a girl boss. She's the breadwinner in the house. So I'm not defending the idea that women shouldn't wear clothes or conduct business. I'm saying that that is the way Ferengi society has been depicted, so that needs to continue. Remember when Quark and Rom's mom came and she was wearing clothes, how they were really upset by this? And then they found out that she was running a business and they got even more upset? You know, some people see that as, well, the Ferengi were evolving. No, they weren't. It was just a one-off story talking about their mother specifically, and it was a pretty good episode. But back to Klingons, you would never have a gay Klingon because they can't continue the house. You would never have 2 fathers in a household because their mating rituals were primal. And I think that for the pushback people like me get, the framing is all wrong. I say I think this gay Klingon is ridiculous, and what you hear is a homophobic slur, and that's simply not the case. I'm saying within the established lore, this would not happen. Can you imagine what Gowron would do if he saw this dude prancing around in a silver dress? His death would be swift. But you tell me, maybe I'm wrong. Did they just abandon all of their sensibilities? I find it hard to believe, even in limited numbers, that the Klingons would just throw in the towel and go, fuck it, let's be gay and wear dresses now. It's just not going to happen. And you can say what you will about my position, but again, I'm not talking about humans. I'm not talking about the gay community. I'm talking about an alien species that would not behave this way in canon. So this ultimately raises a broader question for the franchise. Where is the line between meaningful evolution of a fictional culture and changes so fundamental that they challenge the internal logic that once defined it? And does crossing that line still make sense within the world that it was originally built on? Personally, I think they did it to piss off the fans. You take the most hyper-masculine alien species in all of science fiction history, and you put a dress on him and make him gay. If that's not a middle finger to the fans, I don't know what is. But you tell me, am I right? Am I wrong? Let me know all the reasons I'm an idiot in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, click notifications, and I will see you next time.